Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the Buzzy Pup Bee die set. This is an exclusive die set on Spellbinders website. Absolutely adorable dog dressed in a bee costume. I'm going to be using him all on his own, but if you happen to have the dog that was dressed up as a ghost from a previous year as well, I think there was another one with a pumpkin, these would work really, really well together and be absolutely adorable on or as a card together. And of course, they're absolutely adorable on their own as well. So I have the dog body die cut out of some Acorn Cardstock. The bee costume is die cut out of Beeswax Cardstock, and I have inked the Beeswax Cardstock with some Fossilized Amber Distress ink. The dog, I am inking his pieces with some ground Espresso Distress ink. I did the face or the muzzle and the tail with some Fawn Cardstock, so we have a little bit of color variation. Now, there's not a ton of pieces to him, but I always lay out my pieces so that I have everything ready to go and I can easily see what piece goes next. I also like to glue everything together with some liquid glue. That way I can move and shimmy those pieces in place and I can get the perfect placement with them. Now, most of the pieces that I have cut are just regular cardstock, but I do have the wings cut out of some vellum, so we have a little bit of transparency there. And then the stripes for the bee body, I have that die cut out of some black velvet cardstock. So it's got some nice fuzzy finish to it, just for a little bit of extra texture. I always love finding ways to add different textures to my die cut pieces. I think it just takes them to the next level and makes them a little bit more interesting. When I'm gluing these pieces together, for the tiny pieces, I like to just put the glue on the base piece and then use the wax tip tool to lift it up and place it. For the larger parts, I'll put it on the back and then just place them where they're supposed to go. They're really, really easy to put together. When you die cut these pieces, it puts a little indent showing you exactly where the upper layers are intended to go. So there's very little guesswork to it. And like I said before, by having everything laid out, I know I have all the pieces there ready to go, so I can easily grab them and assemble them. The pieces behind the eyes of the dog were just pieces of black cardstock that I used some scraps for. And then the piece for the little pink nose underneath the muzzle, I just die cut a second pair of the inner parts of the ear and just glued that behind it, but you could also just use a scrap piece of the blush cardstock for that. Once I have everything together, the last thing I'm going to add is the vellum wings. Now, vellum doesn't typically like liquid glue or any liquid of any form, so I'll do that last and then I'll set that aside to dry so that the glue can set for a little bit. Now, for the background, I'm using the Because 3D embossing folder. This is obviously a bee themed. It's got some honeycomb to it as well as some other bees, so I just thought it was a really perfect background for this. This would also be adorable with a Halloween stenciled background or printed paper, or even an embossed background with a Halloween theme to it. But because we've got our little dog dressed in a bee costume, I just thought the Because one was a perfect background for something simple and a little bit more generic. So I just used some Hammermill Cardstock and embossed that. And then I'm using that same Fossilized Amber Distress ink that I used on the body of the bee, just to add a little bit of color variation to the background. So you could also use colored cardstock for this, but I didn't want our little bee pup to kind of blend into the background. I wanted him to stand out. For the mat for this card, I have a piece of black cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And you can see that I die cut my black pieces right out of there. I do this often. It just extends your cardstock a little bit. And because we have both the embossed piece plus our die cut in front of it, we're really not going to see that anything was die cut out of that black cardstock. Again, just a great way to extend your cardstock. This works especially well for specialty cardstocks that tend to be a little bit more spendy. So I'm going to glue my dog to the bottom of this card. Now, he needs a sentiment to him. So I'm going to use the Halloween Dragon stamp set from House Mouse. This came out in the last month, and I'm just going to heat emboss the sentiment with some white embossing powder on some Raven cardstock. Again, just a scrap piece of cardstock works well for this. I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that I can stamp it a couple times just to make sure that I have the full sentiment stamped on there. And I'm stamping it with some VersaMark ink, and I'm going to heat emboss this with some white embossing powder. Now, this is going to go well with the background as well as it's going to work with the white card base. Another option for this sentiment would would be to emboss it with white embossing powder and then use in a yellow Copic marker to color it yellow so that it coordinates with the yellows in the card. I opted to leave it in the white just because I like the crisp white against the black. Now before I heat emboss that powder, I'm just going to remove any little remnants of that embossing powder. Sometimes you'll get a few grains that want to stick where they're not wanted, so take them off before you heat emboss them. I'll let that heated sentiment cool down for like 5-10 seconds, and then I'm using my trimmer to just trim that sentiment down. And when I trim it down, I use my clear finger guard. I use the right side of it, and I just align the sentiment along that right side and then trim it down. It makes it nice and easy to get an even edge all the way around. I'm going to add that to the top of the card, and our card is almost done. And you could leave it like it is. There's a lot of texture with those die cuts as well as our embossed background, but I always love adding a few different finishes. So I'm going to use some stickles on the little antenna from our costume, as well as the eyes from the little cat Halloween trick-or-treat basket. Then I'm using some glossy accents in the dog's nose as well as the cat's nose. There's a little bit of overflow with that glossy accent, so I just used the die pick to clean that up. And we have a super simple card, but absolutely adorable. This little pup is just so cute, and it creates a really adorable card for Halloween and for dog lovers. Now you'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below, as well as the link to the Buzzy Pup Bee die set. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.